Welcome to the Peaceful Prisons podcast, where we explore transformative stories and conversations that challenge the status quo. My name is Balaam Parada. With me
And I,
today is.
I'm Abby Martin.
Today we have a powerful guest, Graham Finochio. After spending 22 years in prison serving a life sentence, Graham has emerged as a dedicated advocate for dismantling toxic masculinity and white supremacy. He's a forensic expert on gangs, bringing real life experience and insights that speak to the heart of these issues. His journey is one of resilience, self reflection, and deep personal growth, and we're honored to share his story with you today. So, we're going to get into this conversation. Graham, how are you?
I'm doing great. I'm really glad to be here. I want to specify one thing. So I wasn't serving a life sentence. I was serving a
Okay.
determinate sentence, but I stretched it out for the majority of my life. So it was like life on the installment plan. The most amount of time that I served was a 15-year stretch from 2019 till, I'm sorry, from 2005 until 2019.
Okay. That's a good stretch. Let me see. There,
There, I'm back.
hold on. There he is. Okay,
All right.
he's back. Okay, cool. Um, so where did you do most of your time? Where did you serve most of your time in prison?
Most of my time was served in level 4 prisons. In California, that means high
Hmm.
security. I also served a large chunk of that time in the SHU program, which is a security housing unit. So I was on, 23-hour lockdown, handcuff shackles, and high monitor, high security.
Hmm. Hmm.
And that's in
Okay.
isolation. You didn't have a cellmate or anything.
We did have cellmates for periods of it. So, like, I lived with people from the specific gang or organization that I was tied in with only, and that was for the majority of it. If there wasn't someone from that gang, then I would be alone.
Okay. So I wanted to ask. We can get into the gangs. We can get into the culture of uh, racism, white supremacy, and I just want to hear your thoughts on that, based on your experiences. What have you learned, and what are your insights? What are your thoughts surrounding gangs and white supremacy?
Sure. So I got involved fairly young, like 14 years old. I started getting involved in stuff, and I mostly walked into it because I was like a squatter. I was a runaway from home. I'd been away from home for about 2 years, and I just happened to run into a group of skinheads in a park. And instead of jumping me, which is what I was used to, they invited me to a show, and I went to a punk rock show. I liked punk rock shows. I liked punk rock shows at that time, and so from that they began like like it's called sponsoring, and so they sponsor you. But I didn't even acknowledge it as that because I was just hanging out with my friends. 'Cause I didn't. I'd like to say that I didn't have like racist thoughts before then, but I'm sure I did. I got picked on and beat up by Asian gangs and Mexican gangs in the area that I grew up in. Um, and so like I think it was really easy for me to buy into, but also like the very strange part is that my family, my grandmother who mostly raised me, was not that way at all and instilled strong virtues against that. So I remember a certain point where like I was essentially being like informally asked to buy into certain doctrines of like, oh, they're over there and they ruin it for us over here, is basically the summation of the conversations that were had. And I remember feeling like a tug on my integrity and making the active choice to choose being accepted as opposed to choosing what I think I intuitively knew was right. And I went with that. And eventually, that was 14. I went through the system from 14 to 18. And when I came home, my thinking was already that like I had always felt that way. And it's funny how belief systems work that way. You hear something, you buy into it, and suddenly that's an objective truth. Uh, but that was my process in, and I studied and I learned as much as I could, and I was going to be the best at this. The strange part about that is like I think it comes like I was extremely poor growing up. I didn't have a whole lot of access to things. I also lived in a toxic environment with my father, my mother going in and out of prison, exposing me to drugs, beating me. My father mostly, my mother did not, beating me or neglecting me. I'd experienced sexual abuse, so I felt small in all these ways. But my masculinity was the one thing that I could tap into. And as a white dude, I think I grasped this concept of white supremacy because it was the one area of privilege that I felt like I had. So masculinity and whiteness. And I'm like, I can do this. I can fight. I can objectify women. I can pursue money, and I can be racist. I could do these things. And then I felt like I had some definition in my soul. That it isn't what it ended up to be, was definition of my soul. It was more of like a mask. But that's how I bought in.
Right.
How did you come to the conclusion that that was covering up all of these things?
It took a lot of work. It took a lot of work, a lot of unlearning. I was in prison for a very long time. I got sentenced to 15 years in 2005. And I went in, and to me, that felt like a life at 21 years old. And having nothing anchoring me to the outside world, I was like, I'll just thrive in here. I'll do all this stuff because basically they ask you to do things. So I'll just do everything. And so I became like king of the skins is what I felt like. Like I was just the best at it. I knew the most. I would fight the hardest. I would do the most violent things. And once I stopped, like I plateaued, there wasn't really much more I could do. And there's a lot of backstory to that. But I was in this like intense conflict, like an internal conflict that was taking place. And I realized at some point while I was riding a baby kite, because you write these little tiny kites in prison from cell to cell, I was riding a baby kite and I'm like, I don't give a shit about any of this. Why am I doing it? And I remember that question came as quickly as it went. And then there was like like I hit 30. I think, your body begins like dying, decaying. At that point you're moving into senescence. And so I feel like my emotions that I'd bottled up my whole life, I'm sitting in the shoe, I'm watching a commercial, and it's the one where they have the Sarah McLachlan song and all the sick animals. And I'm watching it on my TV because you have TVs in your cell, and I felt a tear. At first I was like, what the hell is that? And then I felt like I know what crying is. It would be foolish to say that I didn't cry for any of that time, but like I oftentimes just blocked it, deleted it. But in that moment, I just felt this intensity of emotion that's attached to this commercial that I'd seen 100 times before. And I knew like intuitively that this was everything inside coming out. So that was 30. And again, I pushed it away. I got to a new prison, Soledad, CTF Central. I got out of the SHU. I went through a couple series of transfers, and I went to CTF Central. And that prison was different than anywhere that I'd been. They had an immense amount of groups, like 40, 45 different groups that were offered to the people housed there. All these men were processing emotions at high levels because the governor of California was now letting people go home. So there was hope that I'd never seen so active before in prison. So it was a couple things. It was my first time in a prison like that. It was my first time in a lower level institution. This was like medium to max security. It was my first time in a prison like that. And at first I hated it, and I pushed back against everything. And I'd listen to dudes talking about remorse and insight and accountability, and I'd judge them. And then eventually it just started to sink in, almost like I got exposed, and eventually I drank the Kool-Aid. And so I started going to groups to get out of my cell, and the stuff they were talking about, I think based on my ego, like wanting to be right, I would argue. And they'd offer stuff in response that was not continuing the argument. And I was taken aback by that because I was like, y'all are giving me feedback, and I'm asking for a confrontation. But it kind of hooked me, so I kept going back and kept going back. This took place in Success Stories program, which is the organization that I work very closely with right now, like directly for. And the way that they like created community around just let's have a hard conversation, and we're not really tripping if you agree or not because we're not trying to sell anything to you, really allowed me to buy into stuff that they weren't even selling. And so by 2016, I knew that a lot of changes had to be had. That was all that time before I was all the way in. By 2017, I began taking active steps. I backed away from gang life. I changed. I dropped my handle. I went by Casper for like the majority of my life. And I stopped using that in a general population setting, which is dangerous. Yeah. I told the Aryan Brotherhood and the people that I worked with that I was not going to do that anymore, which is also very dangerous. And then I just dug in and kind of, this is going to sound like corny, but I went to as many groups and college classes as possible so that I could stay off the yard because I knew that the yard was a place. And that's how I found Success Stories and began the work of unlearning some stuff.
Right. What I'm hearing is, well, actually, before I get into asking you about the difference between masculinity and toxic masculinity and those lessons you started to learn and develop going to these groups and classes, I just want to give a little background, a brief little framework for the viewers that may not know. Um, Maybe we can share a little bit about the day to day. Like, what does supremacy? What does gang life look like on a day to day basis in prison? Like what do you wake up doing? What's required of you? What's asked of you? You know what I mean? Can we get into that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So gang life outside and gang life inside are radically different. For me, the outside element felt a lot like community. It was a toxic community, and there was stuff that was asked of you, but there was a lot of like just force and dominance overlaying this community component, right? Inside is the most toxic masculine environment that I've ever seen. And the way that gangs, specifically white folk, but a lot of gangs operate the same way. I'd wake up at 4 in the morning, I would work out, I would shave, I'd make sure that my head was shaved, my face was shaved, I was put together well. I would begin studying until if I'm in the shoe or on the main line differs, but like if I'm going out to a chow hall, I get ready for that. I always have my shoes on in the cell, my mattress is rolled up in the cell. I go to yard when it's open, no matter what. I'm out there, and the
Mandatory
politicking
yard.
begins.
Yeah.
Mandatory yard. The politicking begins, and you kind of just dig into the same conversations every day. It's always about who did what where, who's good, who's not, who has stuff to sell, who doesn't have stuff to sell, who owes money, who's in the hat, stuff like that. And what that basically means is you're just painting targets on people. Um,
Hmm.
and the position that I was in. And this sounds braggy, but it's not at all. Like I was in a leadership position and I was attached to the Aryan Brotherhood. So, like I was the contact point for everybody, which meant all the drugs and all the decisions went through me for multiple prisons. And so stuff was constantly coming to me, both physical stuff in terms of drugs and both things that needed to be resolved on the yard. And by the point when I started making decisions in my life, I was tired of that. Like I didn't want to be
Yeah.
involved in that, but it was really hard to get out of the mode of like, well, might is right, and if someone does something that crosses you, you have to do the utmost. That's where success stories came in and altered my perspective on what masculinity and what my manhood meant, and if it was really something that I should be valuing over my personhood, right? And that was a
Right.
question that was like very, very lucrative emotionally for me.
Right. So when you define manhood today for yourself, how does it differ from how you define manhood back when you were in and just going through
That's
it?
That's a powerful question. So for me personally, and I'm not speaking for every participant or staff member of Success Story, but me personally, I stick
Hmm.
with my humanity over my masculinity. And so I often won't define it because I've come to find that there's a lot of feminine components to the way that I express myself, that there's an equal share and sometimes unequal share of masculinity and femininity that are a part of my person, and I'm okay with that. How that differs to what it was before was like I just had these four rules that I operated on, and I didn't even know the rules, but I was living by them, and everyone around me was too. And that's that, how violent I could be is a measure of my manhood. How much I can do in terms of objectifying women, how many girls I get, how much attention I get, how much I can keep for myself is a measure of my manhood, and how much money I get is a measure of my manhood. And the fourth would be just emotionlessness. So I was allowed to be happy, but only to a certain extent, and I was allowed to be angry to a great extent because that was how I expressed my violence. So like those four things are how I steered most of my life. The way that I define it now, my humanity is, free range of emotions, developing emotional intelligence, understanding what I'm feeling in a moment and how to express it in a way that doesn't hurt the people around me. And that's like day to day work because sometimes it just doesn't end up being that way.
Hmm.
A lot of the time. So yeah, that would be, I don't know if that answered your question.
Absolutely. Beautiful
That's
answer. I love it.
That's a good point. When we talk about emotional development and focusing on, humanity, oftentimes that doesn't come with power or respect or money or all these other things that maybe you were accustomed to being in a leadership gang setting.
Absolutely.
And
Yeah.
how do you cope with that?
That's
How do you
that
tell yourself every day you're enough even though you don't have these things that you once
I
had?
That's an amazing question. I think it's just like, so I play a lot of like word games in my head, and that sounds strange, I know, but like understanding what respect means to me now versus what it meant to me then, or what dignity is now versus what it meant then. So like respect back when I was in my madness was really just about like we've all heard treat others how you want to be treated, but it was really more like you treat me how I want to be treated, and I'll decide whether I want to or not. And if I could do that to everybody, then I'm in the most power. So it was like this external source of power through dominance. And the way that I view power now is internally. This is an internal source. It's this a little ball, a green ball, if you will. And if I'm allowing other people to get my goat, I'm giving away my personal power. And so the way that I maintain my dignity is by managing those relationships with boundaries and making sure that I'm communicating what my needs are from moment to moment, which is also very, very hard work.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, like the prestige isn't there. Like a lot of times, I remember some of my first fights, arguments with my partner now or my ex-wife previously, and I'd say, you know, you hurt my feelings, and I was trying this new thing out. You hurt my feelings when you said that instead of you pissed me off, and she said, grow some balls, and I was like, what the. What, like, and it absolutely made me feel less than. And so then I
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
would take a breath and circle back. God, I want to express. I like for me, my responsibility in the relationships I'm in is to express what my needs are and hear what other people's needs are, and see if we can meet in the middle through all of our trauma and everything. Sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. But in that fight, that struggle is where I find my dignity, and I view respect so drastically different. Respect is literally like seeing someone. The word spect is visual and re is cycle. So like I'm seeing you and then I'm seeing you again. Regardless of how you treat me, I'm going to see you. I'm going to see you. And so in viewing it in that way and playing these word games in my head, I'm able to like, you know, it stops me from a lot of harm that could take place. Doesn't mean I don't still yell or get angry, but like I process what's behind the anger.
I was just thinking something you mentioned about about your interactions with others in our relationships. Um, before it was about getting your needs met, right?
Hmm.
And making sure nobody crossed those boundaries that you put up, right? So now that's changed, but how do we improve the system so that people inside now aren't in that mode of survival and just trying to get their needs met? What's the best way to move forward in
I
in
love that
in
question
respect
so
to
much.
meeting people's needs so they don't feel like they have to scratch and claw and fight to get this respect?
I love that the question is so multifaceted. Like, so we live in a system that's actually built. Like we live in this system, and folks inside are living in a system that's built to create a scarcity mindset. There isn't enough of
Mm,
X to go around. And
right.
so everybody's bumping into each other with these unmet needs and trauma, unresolved trauma and unmet needs, and just clashing constantly, trying to take a piece of whatever X may be. And the system reinforces that, both our systems out here governmentally and locally, and the prison system as a whole. So the prisons are doing exactly what they're designed to do. It's pitting people against one another, it's tearing communities apart, and it's keeping
Hmm.
people isolated in a state of unhealing. And I think that what we offer to people is community. In California,
Mm,
I can speak most to statistics of California because this is where I'm from and I understand it, but I think this goes across the country in various forms and fashions. We previously had an 85% recidivism rate, which means 85% of people were going back in.
it's
And
crazy.
so if it's crazy, and if
Yeah.
you think of it, you take 10 people who are fresh out, right, and you put them
Yeah.
up against a wall, and you look at that wall, 8 to 9 of them are going back. Now,
Yeah.
that is what we would read that as a failure rate, but what CDCR, the prison system, did was read that as a success rate because it upped their budget. It created
Hmm.
more
Right.
prisons. It gave them more jobs. So they're a business built on the backs of our people.
Right.
In 2010, 10, 11 in California, we had this massive hunger strike. It was the first peaceful resistance that ever had been done in California prison history. And all of the prison gangs worked together. I say peaceful, but there was a degree of violence because we were trying to challenge old behavior, but stuff happened. But really, it was us against the system. And we said, we want out of the shoe. We want more groups. We want access to going home. We need the governor to consider people, letting people go home. Because previously, the governor had said hateful things like, the only way a lifer is ever going to go home in California is in a pine box. And he said this publicly. So that was the mindset in California. And then we did this peaceful resistance. And after that, we've slowly began trickling community-based organizations into the prison system to the point of where a prison like Soledad or San Quentin or others have a massive community support. And we go in, and when I work with folks inside, I'm working from the vantage of someone who lived there, not someone who's teaching anyone anything, because I'd like to get that perspective off the table. I'm not teaching. Often I'm learning from folks in there. But we're also just creating space to unlearn stuff and learn new tools together. In doing that, it cements me very much in the way that AA works. And you say, like, if I'm sponsoring someone, it helps them, but it also helps me. In this same way, these community-based organizations are like creating these bastions of civilization where civilization has been stripped from folks inside. And so folks are thinking and doing the work and internalizing and coming home and walking into community. And instead of coming out and being like, I got to figure this all out myself, they're coming out and going, let me tap the people I was talking to in there and let them know I'm struggling with X, Y, and Z. So short answer to a very long answer that I already gave would be like the concept of community and the concept of healing and connectedness is really all it takes. It doesn't matter what curriculum you're operating on. As long as it takes in the needs of the population into consideration and creates healing and connectedness, anything can work. And then folks are entering a community with this concept of care, and it takes the power away from the system and gives it back to us.
So how would you respond to the average, civilian on the outside who's never had an interaction, a one-on-one relationship, say, with someone who's done any amount of time, and we propose this? We say, hey, we need more community. We need more relationships to build this. I feel like the common response is, well, no, they're afraid of those people inside. Those are scary people. Those are violent, aggressive people. How would you address, this problem?
I think the model we use with success stories is relate, and this is our coaching model, but it goes with just all dialogue. Relate, investigate, recreate. And so for a person with that type of background, without those levels of marginalization, I would relate and explain points that I understand and connect with what they're saying, investigate together, and recreate. And I think that the most powerful question in that would be why. So talking to someone who ain't never been locked up, has no one locked up, has always bought the pro-police stance, and believes the system is doing what it is, let's lay out some facts that are actual absolute facts, that the system isn't designed to rehabilitate, it's designed to reincarcerate. Lay that out on the table and explain how, and then talk through and then ask, why are these people harmful? Like what came before the harm for most of these people? Prison is the most toxic environment I've ever been in, but it's also the most amount of people in one place that I've ever seen that are just living through trauma responses on a daily basis. And so why isn't the system doing what it can to help provide space to heal this trauma or process? At least it doesn't, and we got to ask why.
Right. Just in my brief time, I did, a couple years in California, 10 years in Oregon, and they had, some counselors, they had some behavioral health groups you could go to, but nothing near the amount needed to actually meet with everyone individually and do some work, So what kind of work are you doing today, for example?
That's great. And I think circling back to what you just said, like in California, the counselors in California are actually their staff, their cops that actually just process your paperwork for transfer. They have no counseling capacity. To get therapy in California, you're on like a 3 to 6 month waiting list, and you're not supposed to do that. So they set like barriers up every step of the way. And I think that like the work that I go into currently 3 prisons. I go into Corcoran State Prison, where I did my hardest time, into Wasco State Prison, which is a reception center, and into CRC in Norco. And I go in every week, and I run 12 weeks of curriculum and then pod building with the graduates. So with Success Stories, we graduate people into a membership where they can engage in pod work both outside and inside. And that pod work, kind of the things that I've been saying in this interview, are the things that I'm processing. So now the pod gives us space to process with people that we're akin with. So it might be us 3, or it could be 3 other people. We could talk about finances. We could talk about relationships. There's a really loose platform for that. The pods are very autonomous, but it's essentially like an affinity group to support in accountability and living in integrity. So through these pods throughout the state of California, we're providing space for healing from trauma. We're providing resources. Like, I think that that's the biggest problem with our system, is that it's dealing with a bunch of people who are always historically under-resourced and taking more resources from them, right? So we try to provide the resource we can through our limited resources, but like the bridge building between organizations that are abolitionists, between people that really believe in what we're doing, allies, like we're able to find like a really solid pool of resources to filter back job offerings, opportunities to do like speaking engagements, opportunities to do filming like I just did last year. And we kind of work in that way, therapy, counseling, all of those things.
So I wonder how, of all of the people that you're coaching and you're working with, how many are actually just completely uninterested, completely, unable to be, quote, transformed and see this light? What is that percentage? Because often we hear on the outside, somebody committed a crime against their community, and now they need to be away from that community.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think my experience, I've never gauged it in terms of like taking stats to see who's uninterested and interested. My belief, because I know this is how I entered groups, is that even those who are uninterested, like you can light a fire in there. You just got to find the right connecting point, right? So I'll walk into a room, this is hypothetical, but it happens every 12 weeks. So like I'll walk into a room of 30 participants and people are shut down. You can see they got their arms crossed, they're listening, they're checking their watch, they're wondering when it's going to stop. And I just go and I start asking questions and I engage. And this room of 30 people who are on the same yard but have never talked before in some cases, through our prompting and through the exercises we do, now they're connecting with one another and connecting with me. Now this is a 12-week process, so at some point I'm going to touch each person in that room with something, or they're going to reach out to me with some, like I call them signal cries, like something that they say, whether it's pushback, whether it's disagreement, whatever, that's a signal cry to say, this is something that I'm thinking inside, right? This is something going on that challenges me. And I embrace the challenge. And so our coaches are trained to engage in that type of work with people. My belief is nobody's uninterested. And, with a rare, super rare 0.01 percentage of exceptions, which might be mental health concerns or disability, like everybody not only is redeemable, but it just isn't disposable, right? Every single human deserves the outreach.
Absolutely. So then knowing that, what is the argument for building more prisons and keeping that going, when if we're seeing in the current prison system that a large majority of residents want some sort of easier path forward?
I think that it's mostly fear. And fear and anger, and like as people, we love punishment. We love the concept of punishment. We always have since the Stocks, Tar and Feather, Scarlet Letters. We love the idea of shaming and guilting someone to a state of what we've learned is remorse and accountability. But we got a 150-year prison history in this country, right? The first prison being in Pennsylvania, and it's always been this. The idea of a penitentiary is actually religious. It's a concept of where you are going to a place to hold penance and be penitent. I think that it comes from fear and anger, and we have more work to do than they do in terms of challenging that fear and anger, because countries all over the world have challenged that and do implicit biases checks as a culture, and they're able to integrate folks back into their communities, and these folks do amazing. If you look in California, we have 400 nonprofits right now that are existing right now that are founded by people who are formerly incarcerated that are doing this work. So, like, my belief is that every person wants to give back and do something to reverse the harm they've done. If we don't shame and guilt them and we learn collectively what accountability really means, which isn't some sentence, some obscure sentence of X amount of years, that's not accountability. It's something deeper, more refined. If we can learn collectively what accountability means to us, and we offer more space for folks to re-enter society and thrive the way they always should have.
Mm-hmm.
I love that answer so much. And I love that you brought up this fear component because I think for folks or some folks who haven't ever been locked away, there is this sense of deep fear. I'm somehow going to be less safe if my neighbor was formerly incarcerated or if I find out this information, you know, topped with it's now your job to make me comfortable with you living in my community. You were formerly incarcerated. Tell me all of the details. You know, let me check your record. Let me research all about you. You know, tell me every experience you ever had so then I feel more comfortable. And that seems toxic outright too. It's not your job to make me comfortable. It's my job to learn more and grow more so I am comfortable in all situations, loving my neighbors.
Absolutely, I agree. I think I just went through this. I'm applying to move to a new place, and they did a background check. Now, my record's 20 years old because I was gone for so long. But I felt this need to explain it just in case they come across it on the application. And in my explanation, I had to, because I'm typing it, I had to go back and edit to make sure that I was taking any. I'm okay with publicly showing remorse. I don't feel like it's necessary, though. It's not something I wear, it's something I feel. So I went through and edited my initial response to take all of that out. I didn't want to over explain, right? Because I feel like there's a tendency for folks that are previously incarcerated to do that. That's something we can check. And it's also a tendency for people to receive that and be like, okay, this person's below me. And I'm just not okay with putting our people through that. It's not a fair balance, nor is it true. So there's collective work to do on that because folks come home and they feel less than automatically. I still get followed by security through stores. I still sweat when a cop pulls up behind me. Yesterday I was going somewhere in my car and I was going to the prison on Tuesday and a cop pulled up behind me and I turned into a neighborhood to avoid him. I don't have nothing in my car. You can pull me over. I'm off parole. It was just like a guttural response. And so like there's work to unpack stuff like that. And I think affinity groups like pods, like what we're doing, is a great place to process that and give us a more collective understanding.
Yeah.
Yeah, because how does a community start to change that narrative when formerly incarcerated individuals feel that fear, but then also the civilians on the outside are perpetuating that fear? You have good reason to be afraid of a police officer pulling you over because as soon as he runs you, he's going to automatically view you differently. Same with
Yeah.
the renters. How many people applying for apartments or loans are denied purely on that one fact that they were incarcerated one time. So it's this vicious cycle that both parties are contributing to.
Yeah, and I think it roots in shame. It roots in like the historical attachment to shame, the fetish that we have towards shame for ourselves. And so like when I first came home, I came home in 2019. You know, I was still bust back. I didn't have no money. I had no job. I was going out applying for jobs. And you have to disclose your background to your employer, obviously. And in the first two, I stumbled because I felt like I had over-explained. In the next one, the third one down, it was for a moving company. I said, you know what, I'm not going to be ashamed of this anymore. I feel shame over things that I've done.
Yeah.
I feel remorse over things that I've done. I don't need to publicly display it. And so it's been a 5-year path of me challenging that. And I encourage all folks who come home, challenge that. Embrace your past because it can be your biggest asset, right?
Yeah,
So
absolutely. I wanted to ask you about that too, about what you would recommend or what you would say to anyone about to get out. What kind of words of encouragement or hope or reminders of responsibility you would give to those about to parole.
Absolutely stay slow and steady. Everybody comes home. You're dealing I think if I could say something directly, I'd say you're dealing with X amount of years of trauma, because prison is trauma, and everything before that compiled with it. So my suggestion would be to move slowly. You're going to want to go fast. We're going to want to get all the things that you missed out on, and that's just not possible. So move slowly, and when it feels a pull on you, when you feel that pull on you to move quick because you have to make up for lost time, step into community and process that shit. Say just a couple words about what you're really feeling, because that will facilitate the process of healing more than moving quickly and getting all the things and then experiencing burnout or worse.
Absolutely. Real quick, going back to your kind of letting the shame go. At what point did this occur? And if it did, at what point did you kind of appreciate that feeling remorse for your actions as, a former white supremacist, as, a gang member, whatever you were holding on to the shame was? At what point did you disassociate shame and making amends? Because often I feel like I'm seeing people that are, not only making living amends, but like going above and beyond to make amends to a person or a population for one action, one misstep that they took 20 years ago. When do you have to let that go, and how do you separate that?
It's really difficult. It's continual work. I'm still in therapy and in my pods, and I process that because, there's moments that I did a lot of harm to people, both in my gang life, through white supremacy, and even in relationships after I began to process that, like there was harm there. And I feel deep, deep pain and remorse, and often have nightmares, night terrors, experience PTSD, tremors, things like that. So I go to therapy for that, and I also process openly. But the day-to-day work comes around something that I just heard recently that described it better than I ever could. It said, biologically we only have 4 emotions. So we have our historical emotions are mad, glad, sad, and scared. That's it. Basically, that's what we had. Everything else is a volume knob on that. So paying attention to the shame is sadness and also anger. And it's just those knobs turned up. Give me the personal power to turn those knobs down, check in with myself, and pay attention to how I can turn those knobs down. The way I do that is through continual work. I know that the work that I do is a process of amends that's going to require the rest of my life. Speaking out about white supremacy without isolating folks who are actively engaged in it or canceling them allows them space to come into the conversation, which has worked. I've had great success with that. And I do that kind of with everything. I feel like if I really don't believe in punishment, then no one deserves to be punished. That doesn't take away consequences, but punishment, the idea of like, I'm going to beat you down with shame, guilt, and isolation, I don't believe in. So that means no one deserves to be punished. So I work with people through that lens, and it helps me continue the process of amends. And I'd say I'm better today than yesterday, and hopefully that continues tomorrow.
Very nice. Go ahead, Abby.
Thinking about punishment and consequences, I think in today's modern world, often those are interchangeable. And do you ever feel like you committed crimes against a community and now you don't deserve good things? And is that a consequence, or are you just kind of narrating this continual punishment in your own mind?
I think it's tricky because, consequences are not negative and positive reinforcements. So like there's consequences to every action. I believe in negative and positive reinforcements. So like drink too much, the natural negative consequences are biologically things are going to fall apart, and also the world around me, it's going to affect those things. There's an amends to make to that. I think that those consequences are enough. It doesn't need to be beaten down or added to by anybody else. That doesn't mean that it won't upset, let's say, my partner if I drank too much. And my partner has feelings in that. My amends are acknowledging her feelings and allowing her to express them. And that's also a consequence. I think that the idea that you have to model shame is not actually a consequence, and it doesn't do anything beneficial. It creates fear, right? Like, so a person who's engaged in white supremacy, there's what they're doing that they can make amends for and alter and reverse. And then there is the systemic ways that that's reinforced. And those are the things that we can attack and disassemble and abolish and create new systems. But for the person, the individual, the tendency to punish gives great space to challenge the tendency to punish, right? Like Just the tendency itself allows the space to actually challenge that and find a different conclusion.
Yeah, it sounds like there's work that needs to be done on every side. People going through it, and the administrators of the justice, so to speak. Any final thoughts? I appreciate you touching on toxic masculinity, white supremacy, your experiences, and your growth. Your growth is amazing. The person I see now doesn't resemble the person you're describing, 15, 20 years ago. It's amazing.
Thank you so much. That means everything to me. I really appreciate y'all opening this space. And yeah, thank you so much. That's all I have to say.
Absolutely. And we'll put a link up to success stories.
Great.
Is there any other work you're doing besides just success stories?
I also operate as a forensic gang expert. I go into court and work with often defense attorneys to try to mitigate or absolve lengthy sentences in favor of like treatment for these traumas. So that's other work that I do. And then I facilitate community organizing training sessions through another organization called Initiate Justice.
It's such important work, and it's so necessary because there's thousands and thousands of people that need that type of relationship and community to help them kind of break out of that shell, take off those masks, and begin to grow, so to speak. So thank you for your work, and thank you, Abby, for being here with us as well. Graham, appreciate you, appreciate your time. And to all the listeners, appreciate you too. We'd love to hear your thoughts and opinions on the episode. So have a good day. Appreciate your time.